for us. We do record these sessions, so if you think this is going to be valuable for somebody that didn't have a chance to make it today, let us know and we will send you the recording. And actually at the end, we're going to ask you to fill out a survey, and everybody that fills out the survey will get access to the recording as well. If you don't know what School16 is, we are an education company that helps people develop skills for non-technical roles in tech. And that's why we feature speakers like Nicole on a weekly basis to give you insight into exactly what each role is and what skills are in high demand in tech, because technology is evolving at a rapid pace. And it is one of the few sectors where you don't necessarily need decades of experience to land roles that are actually high compensation and have really fun and cool responsibilities as well. We got into tech, me and Sergey, after being in finance for a couple of years, and we started off in sales ourselves, but then ended up having careers in sales, product, sales engineering, enterprise sales, and had our own startups as well.
Yeah, we're I guess a little bit biased, but in our experience, we think that the best tech professionals are well-rounded professionals, and that's why we started School16. We wanted to bring the kind of expertise that you get from people that have different experience across the technical function to you every single week, and that's why every week we bring different folks like Nicole who typically have varied careers. You probably noticed this as a pattern, that they might have started in one type of function and moved to another. And we think that makes the strongest tech professionals, and that's the kind of content that we want to deliver to folks every single week. Just a quick agenda here for how this is going to go. We're in this 5-minute period right now with an introduction from us, just to give context for all the folks here that might be new about what School16 is. We also are going to obviously ask Megan to introduce herself, and I'm sorry, not Megan. This is sorry, Nicole. This is from an old slide. We're gonna ask Nicole to introduce herself, of course, and not Uber, but Lyft, which is a botch. We're gonna change that. Sorry about that. And of course, we're gonna have a discussion around what makes someone like Nicole successful in her role, and then we're gonna get into a Q&A. Please remember, again, if this is your first time, that we monitor the chat very actively. So don't be shy. If you have a question, please type it into the chat. If you don't ask it, we will not know. So that's the only way we'll know. And we try to fit as many questions as possible. You know, we do this for you. So we want you to ask questions of Nicole. We want you to ask her questions about her career, her time at Lyft, you know, anything that you want. When we're going to try to answer those questions, of course, our conversations here are focused around career development and career growth. So try to keep your questions around that, but otherwise we are quite flexible about what we ask, and we're going to watch the chat the entire time. I also wanted to really quickly, again, mostly for folks that are new, some of you might know about this, but we wanted to announce that applications are now open for our 8-week certificate program for people that want to get training across the 4 core non-technical areas in technology, which is sales, product, marketing, and operations, that want to learn directly from experts at top technology companies like the ones we bring you here every single week. We are emphasizing the program this week in particular, and we will be in the next couple of weeks as well, because we have limited scholarships available that we're prioritizing for early applicants. If you get your application in this week, there's a higher likelihood that you can get a scholarship for the fall program. And if you're not ready to, that's okay. We are hosting information sessions starting this week. So if you go to school16.co/info, you can sign up for an information session, talk to us. We'll learn a little bit about your goals, tell you about the program, and see if it's a fit. So please sign up. We'd love to see you there.
Awesome. Thanks, Sergey. All right, so let's get into our discussion with Nicole. We'll stop sharing the screen so we can all see Nicole. And we're going to actually start this conversation again in a very similar way that we usually do. And that is just to have you walk us through your background, the story of your career, because I know that you did a bunch of interesting things even before you joined Lyft, and now you're at the next stage in your career where we want to congratulate you on starting at HBS for your MBA in September. But for the last year or so, you have been at Lyft, so part of the conversation will of course focus on that. But if you don't mind just starting us off, Nicole, and talking us through the story of your career and what you've been up to up until now.
Of course. Thank you for having me. And first, I hope everyone who's joining is safe and doing as well as they can in this time. And if, as I'm speaking, whether I'm answering questions or now, you have a question or a comment, feel free to, like they were saying, to put it in the chat, because I'll try and address as I go, if possible. So I'll keep an eye on it as well. But so I started my career actually doing something completely different from anything that I ended up doing afterwards. I was a sales assistant at NBC Universal for their primetime television group. And I very quickly realized that that wasn't for me. I couldn't see myself being the people that I was working for or working with. And I was finding it really difficult to find opportunities to grow within the organization because it was so big. So I took a chance and I took a job at Tribeca Enterprises, which is the parent company to the Tribeca Film Festival. For those of you who are not New Yorkers, it's one of the premier New York City events, which was started right after 9/11. I had an interest in film, but really and this has been most of my philosophy in my career, I was working for my boss, and that was what excited me about the opportunity. So my job there was really to focus on everything not festival related and to grow additional revenue streams for the business. So I can dive into what I did there, but from a functional standpoint, it was a lot of corporate development and operations. So a lot of high level strategy, deciding what a new business unit was going to look like, or how we were going to expand internationally, and then really taking that all the way through to fruition in terms of down to the details of an event execution or a launch execution, et cetera. After that, I wanted to work at a similarly small company, but one that was growing a lot quicker than I was seeing growth at Tribeca. So I transitioned to a company called Home Polish. It was a Series A startup, and I was employee 30. And again, I was really attracted to the mission of the company. For those of you who weren't familiar, it no longer exists. So if you don't feel bad for not knowing it. But it was an interior design company that was focused on improving the experience, in-person experience of interior design through technology. So tools that were available to designers primarily, but also tools that were helping the experience as a consumer of interior design, help the process go better. And so again, there I started doing brand partnerships because I wanted to get my foot in the door, and I was pretty confident that I could weasel my way into the role that I wanted. I was also clear with them when I started, and ultimately ended up establishing the business operations team there, which meant that I was essentially functioning as an internal consultant. I worked on this to grow the sales team. I worked to manage our designers. I worked on our marketplace. So I had a really wide range of roles there, but again, it was full strategy all the way through to execution. As I mentioned, Home Polish folded. Unfortunately, we had a bridge round, and unfortunately we couldn't raise Series B. And so the company folded. I knew I was going to business school, as they mentioned. And so I wanted an opportunity in the interim that was going to be completely different from anything I had done. So I found Lyft, I interviewed, and I decided to work there. I was attracted to it because Lyft, as everyone knows, is a massive publicly traded company. It's in the services space, excuse me, and long-term, I'm interested in work that really, that touches more on social impact. And the opportunity for me at Lyft was to manage our wheelchair accessibility program. So ensuring that people who are differently abled in New York City have the same access on demand to vehicles and rides as any other person in the city. And so my technical title there was a market operations lead. I was focusing specifically on the New York City market. Lyft structures the team that way, where you have local operations teams, and then you have one or two people who are sort of overseeing operations globally. And I was also doing some compliance operations work there. And so that's sort of the trajectory of my career. As you guys were mentioning, I think it's somewhat typical of people who work in tech, and that a lot of times they're all over the place. But I think for operations specifically, being a generalist is really important. It makes it so that you can kind of jump in on any project at any given time. And so I think that's sort of been the strength of my experience, although it seems a bit disparate. There are definitely threads in terms of functionality that have sort of helped me succeed in each successive role.
Very interesting. So what was your major in undergrad?
I majored in social anthropology. Nothing, as people would say, nothing that's practical, like as my grandparents would tell me maybe. But I actually do find that social anthropology was helpful because you're learning about people, you're learning about what drives communities, and how people interact with each other. And although operations on the surface doesn't look like that, any ops person is highly cross-functional, and your job is to interact with people on a day-to-day basis, much more so than I think a lot of other roles. So it has come into handy from that perspective.
And do you feel that you're naturally like a process-oriented person? You tend to see a situation and look for ways to find efficiency there, or did you evolve that throughout your career, like when you start off as a sales assistant and then going forward as well?
Great question. I am definitely naturally that person, probably to a fault, as my family or my partner would tell me. I love to make a list. I love to create a process. My instinct is that there's like a right way to do something, and to try and find the right way. By the way, there's not always a right way to do things. There's just one way and another way, and some ways are better than others. But that was definitely at my core, and not something that I that I picked up along the way.
Interesting. So we're definitely going to dig into how the role at Lyft ended up playing out. But to take a step back, you started off at NBC. Great job on getting that logo on the resume early on as well. But your role was a sales assistant. So what would you say, I guess, from that experience, what contributed the most to developing your career or developing your skill set? Maybe you could talk a little bit about what you actually did day to day there, but what do you think really helped you level up and get to that next stage in your career while you were at NBC?
Yeah, so I would say that I actually found NBC slightly limiting, in that I don't know that NBC in particular helped me level up to get to the next stage of my career, if I'm being completely honest. I would say the skill set that I was forced to lean into, which I think is or maybe it's not a skill set, but a principle that I was forced to accept, which I think is a good one for people to accept early on, is that no matter how much experience you have, or how smart you are, or how well you can grasp a concept very quickly coming into a job, you always need to be willing to roll up your sleeves and do the dirty work, so to speak. And that's probably what NBC taught me most, which was that seeing how difficult it was to climb the ranks there, but that and obviously NBC has existed for, I don't know how long, but tens of years, that something works in that process, which is to have a much more structured leveling within the company. And so learning to accept that, I think, was important for me within that role. I clearly didn't want to accept it for too long, because I left so that I could take on more responsibility. But having moved to different companies since then, I do think that it's something that, being able to go back to that place is really important.
And then, so was it a pretty conscious decision for you to join a smaller company afterwards so you can have more responsibility?
100%. That was exactly why. I was going to be able to own projects. I wasn't owning anything really at NBC. I was a contributor, but I wasn't a decision maker. I wanted to be making decisions. I wanted to be able to fail and learn from those decisions. And so the smaller company gave me the opportunity to do that, as well as I mentioned, I was working for someone who had long been a mentor of mine. So he was entrusting me with a lot more responsibility than perhaps I would have gotten, even if I came into that same company, perhaps under a different person.
So then when you got into that role and all of a sudden you were more empowered by him to make decisions, how did that feel? Were you pretty confident in making decisions? Were you worried I'm going to mess up and make the wrong decision? How did you fit into that role?
Yeah, it was scary. I was working in an industry that I knew a little bit about. I knew a lot about the film festival because I grew up in New York, but as I mentioned, my job was to work on everything outside of the film festival. So I was working on projects related to video gaming, which I knew nothing about. I was working on launching international film festivals. I knew nothing about how to transfer a business model from the US to something internationally. I was working on a subscription video on demand service through a strategic partnership with Lionsgate. looking through those strategic partnership documents and sort of defining how we were working together. I had never dealt with any of that before. It was really scary. But I'm the type of person that likes a challenge, and I'm very curious. So giving myself the opportunity to learn in that way, to, in my spare time when I went home, I read up on how to structure a strategic partnership, or what are the biggest video gaming companies, and what are they doing in the event space. So that's sort of how I leveled up to it, but it absolutely was scary. And like I said, I think having a good boss and a mentor is really important. In this particular situation, my boss and my mentor were one and the same. But he gave me the confidence that if I failed, if I made a mistake, it was okay. And so that's kind of just how I navigated. I did something wrong, I checked with him, I went back, etc. But it was definitely scary.
Yeah, and not surprised to hear that, and the fact that you spend time on your free time looking up how things are done. And like folks on the call, understand that even executives do this. They look up stuff that they've never done before. Like, no one's born knowing how to solve every single problem, and it's okay if you don't know. You can find the information either yourself or ask somebody. You know, this concept of a mentor, someone that kind of helps guide you, but also helps you get opportunities, is something that has been recurring with a lot of the sessions that we've had here weekly. Can you talk a little bit about how you got this mentor, how you found them, how that relationship evolved?
Yeah, totally. So I look for mentors and sponsors in any role that I'm in, or in any networking events, etc. This particular mentor, his name is John Patrikoff. I met him, I was an intern for him one summer. I met him through my stepfather, and I really just enjoyed my experience working with him. I felt that he was pushing me in ways that I hadn't been pushed in internships before, asking me really difficult questions. And so we just stayed in contact. And in terms of developing that relationship, I made a point to reach out to him at least once every few months. And even if I didn't have anything material to say at that point, I was still in college. So, you know, I was saying, oh, the semester is going well, my class in X is interesting. You know, ultimately, he probably didn't really care to hear about that. But what it does is it sort of it keeps the connection, and kept me top of mind as he was thinking about, you know, opportunities that were coming across his way, whether that was at the company he was working for at the time, or somewhere else. So I would say staying in contact with the mentor or sponsor is important. And then being able to have that personal connection, I think, is also really important. I've tried to build relationships, perhaps with people who had roles that I just thought were really inspiring, but we didn't necessarily connect on that personal level or have the chance to build that type of relationship. And those types of relationships have proven valuable if I ever need sort of one-off advice, but less valuable from a sponsorship perspective, where they're actually willing to go ahead and get me a particular opportunity or advocate on my behalf.
Got it. So, okay. So it sounds like although it was somewhat organic, where in that internship he was pushing you, you had to kind of proactively keep reaching out and updating, even if the update wasn't necessarily significant, but just to stay top of mind. That's kind of how you did it?
That's correct.
And have you continued doing that with when trying to get other mentors? I think for a lot of people, it feels like an unnatural thing to do, to ask somebody to be your mentor. Is this something you've continued doing?
Yeah, so it's interesting you say ask somebody to be your mentor. I know that people do that, and they actually use that terminology. They'll ask someone to be their mentor or their sponsor, and they'll kind of formalize the relationship in that way. And I see value in doing that, because then it's very clear from both sides sort of where the relationship lies. I've never asked in that particular way, but in terms of finding other mentors or sponsors, I've used a very similar strategy as I did with John, who I would argue was my first mentor, which is to follow up pretty consistently, even if I don't really have anything material to say. It feels really weird to do this, guys. I still feel strange doing it, but it's actually received well. People like knowing that you want their advice, that you want to keep in touch with them, that you see them as somebody who has been impactful to you. And so even reaching out to say nothing makes them feel good a little bit too. So I found that really valuable I have I'd probably say one other mentor slash sponsor, and another just mentor. And I've used that same tool.
I think that's great advice. You know, people do feel like they might be bothering somebody else. They feel trepidation going for the ask. But like Nicole just said, oftentimes people like hearing, I mean, especially if they like you, which obviously that's the baseline. They have to like you as a person. You have to like them, right? You don't want to force this, just like any relationship. But if they like you, they're going to like hearing from you. And you kind of have to weigh it against the what's the worst thing that can happen scenario, which is they don't respond, or maybe they're not going to be in a position to help you at that time, right? There is really no negative to following up and staying in touch. So you might as well do it.
Totally.
So, okay, so now I want to talk about dig into a little bit deeper about your decision to go to Lyft. You know, at this point, you had a bunch of responsibilities, you were in a cool role. Why not join, let's say, a quickly growing startup with like 10 people, 15 people that just raised $2 million seed round that would give you like 5-10% equity, right? I don't know, something in that vein. Why not continue on that path? Why did you decide to join a massive company like Lyft or pursue that in the first place?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there were really two motivating factors. The first is that as I mentioned, I knew I was going to business school and I wanted to use the time to work somewhere that maybe I didn't see myself working at long term. And I knew that I thrive in sort of a small to medium size environment. So I wanted to push myself to work at a company that was large, or at least large from my perspective, and established. And so the way I was evaluating established was, or this is what I thought, and we can get into this further, was, you know, they're about, it depends on when you count the actual foundation of Lyft. There's debate about that, but, you know, was at least 5-6 years old, and had IPO'd. Had offices in multiple cities, in fact, multiple countries, and was doing billions a year. That was criteria number one. The second criteria was, you mentioned NBC as sort of being on my resume. I actually don't even have the opportunity on my resume anymore because I was there for such a short period of time. I wanted another name that people could recognize. I saw that, you know, as I was trying to transition into Lyft, it took me quite a bit of time to find that opportunity, partially because I wasn't putting 100% in, but also partially because the companies that I'd worked for before, even though my roles functionally were really applicable to what I was looking to do, nobody recognized the names of those companies. So I wanted to make sure that I could get something on my resume where people would recognize the name, and have an understanding sort of immediately of the type of environment that I worked at. So those are the two motivating factors.
So then, and I think that's a great reason, and to join a company, partly because, you know, there's a certain environment in a company like that already that has an established brand and has grown and IPO'd, but also having that brand recognition on your resume, on your LinkedIn, is important if you want to get more opportunities.
And by the way, pro tip, if you don't have a big name on your resume, but you've worked with big name clients, you can name drop the clients that you worked with as well, because clearly that signals that you've been trusted to work with, you know, credible clients as well.
That's right.
100%.
So you mentioned it took a little while to find that opportunity. Can you unpack a little bit about how you found it and how you convinced Lyft to hire you, given that you didn't have a name brand on your resume?
Yeah. So at that point, I was doing like all of the pound the pavement techniques. I was applying left and right via LinkedIn. I was also applying on websites. I was looking for mutual connections at those particular companies, reaching out if I didn't have any. I was asking my mentors, my sponsors, my friends, if they had mutual connections. Of course, I had tons of conversations where I did have mutual connections and I knew people working there. And then the one thing that popped was Lyft, where I had 0 connections. And sometimes it just happens that way. But I probably put out like at least 50 applications for jobs when I was looking. I mean, it was a lot. I think what ended up pushing me over the edge, as you guys just mentioned, is my resume. And so even though they didn't recognize the companies that I had worked for, there were a couple things I think that made me stand out. The first thing, and I'll just say this because it's top of mind because you just mentioned it, I had worked with really big brands. So even though I wasn't working at those companies, I had worked with really big brands. I had managed partnerships with Frigidaire, KitchenAid, Riot Games, which maybe some people don't know, but is like a massive video gaming company. And so those things I think helped me stand out. The second is the story that I told in my resume, leveraging impact and numbers. I think that's like number one tip for your resume, right? Make sure that you are articulating the impact that you made at that particular company. And I was bullish about that with my resume, especially because I was going into an ops role at a company that's very data driven and tech in the tech space, right? So I wanted to make sure that I could showcase that and showcase that I have that foundation, or at least I can think in those terms. So I think those are probably the few main things that helped me stand out.
And that was ultimately you got your foot in the door just through applying?
Correct.
But
yes.
applying for a pretty targeted role.
Yes, I was exclusively looking for business operations or operations roles. And I was looking at two types of companies. One was large companies in the tech space, so like Airbnb, Lyft, Uber, the works. And then the other was actually ancillary, more in the hospitality space, because I'm interested in building premium or experiences for consumers, and I love travel. So I was thinking about both things and figured whatever pops first, we'll see what comes up. But yes, it was just applying on the website, applying on LinkedIn, and of all the places where I didn't have a connection, that one ended up working out.
Can you tell us a little bit of what that interview process was like for this operations role?
Sure. Yeah. So I had a phone interview. Everyone jokes still to this day that my interview process was like the longest in the history of Lyft. It was 3 months. I had a phone interview in which it was mostly a fit interview. So they just asked about my previous experience. They asked why I felt I was qualified for the role. I got to clarify a lot of questions about exactly what they were looking for. After that, they had a challenge. So they sent me a scenario related to the work that I was going to be doing. So I ended up managing, as probably 75% of my job, the wheelchair accessibility program. They sent me a series of questions related to the program that I had to answer. I had to put together a presentation and be prepared to present for 15 to 20 minutes to a panel of 3 to 5 people. And then they would grill me with questions afterwards. There was no direction in terms of the presentation besides make sure you answer these 3 questions. So I had to figure that piece out on my own. And then after I did the presentation, there was a final round, which was basically just kind of like a confirmation where I met with a few of the cross-functional partners that I would be working with to make sure they were on the same page as my future boss. So it was those 3 phases.
Got it. So then once you landed at Lyft and started digging into the role a little bit, what would you say is something that surprised you about the role or even how things worked operationally?
Yeah. The biggest thing that surprised me was, as I mentioned, one of the reasons I went there is I wanted to work for a large established company. From an ops perspective, I was used to building things from the ground up, and I felt like I wanted to see I wanted to have a more formalized experience. So I think the biggest surprise to me coming into Lyft is that there was no formality about the way operations work there. I think part of it was because I was managing a program that was relatively new. It had launched a month and a half, 2 months before I came onto the team. So it was still very new, but I think part of that is also just a reflection of most tech companies, definitely Lyft, because we're growing really quickly right now, in that things are just changing so quickly. And so in many operations capacities, people are not necessarily taking the time to fully document things because 2 weeks from now it's going to change. And so they feel like, what's the point? So to me, that was the biggest surprise, because I was expecting, and I don't even know what I really thought a formalized ops machine would look like. I just figured, okay, there's going to be a set way that they do things, and there'll be playbooks that I need to follow. And I really had to help build all of that out, because it was what I was used to doing, and I knew how to build that all from scratch and build tools for myself in Excel, etc. But it was definitely not what I was expecting coming in.
Interesting. So I'm curious, you know, you had to develop this stuff from scratch. How did you know how to do it, or how did you figure it out? Like the playbooks and kind of the processes for this team, especially since it's a public company.
Yeah. So in terms of the playbooks, when I started at Lyft, playbooks were not even something that had been formalized across the company. I will not take credit for having that been formalized across the company. In my time at Lyft, they launched a formal business operations team, essentially, that was helping to create these frameworks that local operations teams could use. But when I first started, it was something that I'd done in my previous job. The way I knew how to do that is that I literally Googled, when I was starting my business operations unit at my former company, Home Polish, I Googled, what do business operations people do? And I read that they create playbooks. I read that they create processes. I read about what the differences between those two things were. I had asked my boss, who had done business operations at some other companies, how does this work? And so that's how at Lyft, I knew where to start in terms of, okay, let's create a playbook so that anyone who's touching this knows what the mission is for this particular project, what our goals are, what our metrics are, what the timelines are, who are the key players internally and externally, et cetera. So playbooks and processes were sort of the first place that I started. And then the second was really on the data and impact side. As I mentioned, something that I found really important in my career to date has been being able to articulate impact. I am not the most data savvy person, hence part of the reason I'm going to business school. I want to be better with numbers, data, finance, all of that. But I know that it's important, and I know that that's how you grow within a company and get recognized for the work that you're doing. So there was someone on my team who was quite brilliant, really good with numbers. We use a system called Mode at Lyft, which was new to me. So I had to learn how to use that, as well as SQL, which is a language, coding computer language. I still don't know. I'm like learning still. But
language, I guess.
Yeah, there you go. So I worked with someone on my team who was really great at that to help me. I basically articulated to him what I envisioned in terms of showcasing our impact, and then we worked together to actually bring that to life. So, that brings up another point, which I think when you're coming in, and if know what you know and also own what you don't know, and find people who know how to do that and then work with them to do it for you. Obviously, I still tried to spend some of my time learning SQL, and I didn't want to be completely out of the loop in terms of that type of work, but I knew I wasn't going to be an expert. So I just needed to know enough to communicate with the experts on my team. And then together we could work through creating those dashboards. It was mostly dashboards actually to demonstrate the impact outwards.
Yeah, I actually had a similar experience with SQL where my VP of product in my last role, sales engineering role, delegated to me to create a bunch of SQL queries to get data for our customers and our internal team as well. And like, I learned enough to be dangerous, but the thing is, like, the way our system was set up is if you made a mistake, it would slow down all of the analytics for every single customer. So I would quietly just ping my DevOps engineer and get help from him, because it made more sense to go to someone that actually knew what they were doing, but I was still developing that skill in the process. So I totally agree.
I'm understanding conceptually kind of what an operations person does, but I'm curious from the context of, this thing that you guys are bringing to market, accept more accessibility for people that want to have take rides in Lyft in New York. Like, what is really the operations team function in making that a reality in a company like Lyft?
Sure. It's a great question. So wheelchair accessibility, people who are differently abled need different types of vehicles than people who are not differently abled. These vehicles need to be bigger. They need to have particular securements so that someone who's in a wheelchair or has other material with them to help them move can safely store that in the vehicle. So task number one is making sure we have those types of vehicles on the road, right? And we didn't. So when I came on board, we did, because like I mentioned, they had launched the program about 2 months ago. So when I came on board, it was, okay, we have these vehicles on the road. Do we have the right number of these vehicles on the road? And are they where they need to be, right? So it's a supply demand question. So the first thing I did was say, okay, we've got, I'm making up numbers here because I can't share the actual numbers. So I'm going to use crazy, ridiculously low numbers. We've got 10 vehicles on the road, but we actually, and those 10 vehicles cost us $100,000. But we actually only need 5 vehicles. So why have 10? Let's pull those back. So that was sort of phase one for me of what it really meant from an operational perspective. That's the supply side, as we would call it. Then also thinking on the supply side is where these vehicles are. So if you think about an on-demand service, when you guys are ordering a Lyft, you'll call the car, and usually you can get one within anywhere from 1 to 4 minutes, depending on where you are in the city. You can imagine that if you have fewer vehicles on the road that can take you in a wheelchair, that those ETAs, as we call them, are going to be higher. So how can I make sure that that experience for the person in the wheelchair is not too different from someone who's just calling a regular vehicle? You shouldn't have to wait 10 times longer just because you're differently abled. That was the goal there. So what that means is I have to think about exactly where these vehicles should be throughout the city in order to make sure that the experience for the end consumer is as close as possible to what a standard consumer would experience. And then, so that's really the supply side. There's a lot more I can get into it if people have questions later. But that's really what the operations is like, where do we put these vehicles? And of course, you use a lot of data and analytics to figure that out, right? And then how many of these vehicles do we need on the road? And when you know that, how do you actually pull them back? Do you partner with an external organization? Let's say you need more vehicles. Do we partner with an external organization to get more vehicles, or do we purchase more vehicles? Which makes more sense? Which is easier to operate? Which is cheapest? Which is always a big question for ops people. So that's the supply side. The demand side is really just making sure that we were promoting this as a service, that people within the differently abled community knew that this is something that we offered, and that we could service them and provide as the best experience possible.
That's really interesting. So, I'm curious because yes, Lyft is a technology company, but it's also a technology-enabled business, really. I mean, it's logistics in the end of the day.
Yeah.
And so I'm assuming that a company like Lyft probably relies really heavily on their operations team, and there's probably a lot of people in operations roles. So Can you talk about how that's organized internally? Your title was market operations lead. I believe you also worked with people in like corporate operations. So can you talk about that hierarchy a little bit more? How were the teams structured?
Totally. So every market, which is a city, although some markets get lumped where you'll have a market operations team that covers multiple cities. Every city essentially, for the sake of this conversation, has a market operations team. The size of that team varies and depends on the size of that particular market. As you can imagine, markets like New York, LA, San Francisco have larger teams than ones that are in more rural markets. And then those teams roll up into regional directors. So regional directors manage not only market operations, but also what we call driver service. And then those regional directors rolled up into our global operations team. So on the global operations team, you had for the sake of the example, a VP of global operations, and then you had a few people underneath that person who are sort of overseeing the entire operations business. And so not only were they sort of diving in certain markets when we had particular issues or needed extra assistance, but they were also creating some of those, what I mentioned, processes that could be applied across multiple markets, since they had the visibility to see what was going on across multiple markets and not just within their own unit. So you're playing with hyper local operations, which are very important to Lyft, because you can imagine we have these drivers that are in a particular market, and we want to make sure we're creating the best possible platform for them. But they did want to layer on, which I think made complete sense, that 100-foot view that allows you to create efficiencies across markets, et cetera.
So I'm curious to dig into something. And by the way, folks, we have about 15 minutes left here in today's session. So if you have questions, do type them into the chat now to make sure that we can catch them before we wrap up here. But could you give us a little bit more of a sense of the day in the life for you? Because, it sounds like you have to do a lot of work with data, and
Yep.
that actually helped you realize that it's something that you want to develop more as a skill. But you also mentioned things like making sure that on the demand side, people are aware. So I'm assuming you're working with marketing teams. I know from our conversation before that you also created playbooks, you implemented Salesforce, you did all these other things. So can you talk to me how you divided your day? And was it a lot of it reactive work, or were you also kind of taking charge on new projects as well yourself?
Totally. So as it relates to the wheelchair program, I was mentioning the wheelchair accessibility program at Lyft was probably 70 to 75% of my time. As it relates to that specifically, I would say day to day, maybe 60% of my day was spent in meetings with partners. Half of those meetings were external partners, so people who are providing these vehicles to us or providing sets of drivers to us. And then the other half was internal partners, as you mentioned, marketing, product, and then our data science team. And so that's how, I forget which, yes, I think I said 60% of my day was in meetings. So that's how the 60% goes. Then the other 40% is really some of the day-to-day upkeep, right? So we have to make sure that we are paying drivers appropriately in this program, because there are different systems for paying these drivers. We have to make sure that we are checking for instances of fraud. So going into, running small, short little processes to check these kinds of things. Running reports on driver behavior and escalating that up to the appropriate team. So that's probably what the rest of the other 40% of my days were spent doing as it relates to the wheelchair accessibility program. I would say the other 25 to 30% of my work, which was additional projects, for that work, it was very cross-functional, and that was the nature of how market operations is set up at Lyft. So it would really be when other teams had things that they needed local expertise on. So for example, the healthcare team was looking at launching a Medicaid program. They know what the national regulations are, what the regulations are in New York, but they need our team to say, okay, we can guarantee that you could have ETAs of X amount. We can guarantee that you'll have more cars available in this time of day versus this time of day. So those are the other sort of more like, I wouldn't call them strategic, but the other bucket of projects that I would work on. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's helpful. Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Nicole. We have our first audience question here, which is from Philip. What is the biggest struggle or hurdle your team has faced while working on the accessibility program?
Great question, Philip. Cost. It is an incredibly expensive program to operate. This is because if you start from the beginning of the experience, you start with the vehicle. The vehicle is one of a few types. The main type is a Toyota Sienna. It has to be converted to allow that wheelchair to get in there. That conversion costs tens of thousands of dollars. We're not doing that conversion as Lyft. Providers are. But you can imagine they spent all that money. So if somebody's renting that vehicle or somebody buys that vehicle from them, it's going to be really expensive. So that's really where the costs start. And then you have to think about, the experience of a driver. So a driver, when they're driving differently abled people, they have to get out of the vehicle. They have to help the passenger into the car. They have to strap them in. In a market like New York, where drivers are really professionals, they're doing this, they're earning a living doing this. Many of them just want to do ride after ride after ride. and the thought of doing fewer rides is less attractive to them. So as Lyft, we had to incentivize these drivers to take these types of rides, because you can't do as many of these as you can a standard ride. So all that to say, it means that to operate this program is incredibly costly. Like, I'm talking in the multiple millions of dollars. And you toe this line. It was something that we had to do. So I want to be clear, the government, the TLC, mandated that this is a service that we offer, but it also was very aligned with Lyft's mission of increasing accessibility to transportation. And so it was something that Lyft, we want to do, right? And so you have this difficult balance of, it's really expensive and we have to do it. How can we provide a really good service at a lower cost? The program I was managing, that wheelchair accessibility program, is probably the biggest line item for global operations across the country, the New York City program itself. So the biggest hurdle is figuring out how to get those numbers down. Operationally, it was really hard to do that. So one of the things I had to pivot to, I mentioned talking about impact and data, and this is where I relied on some of my team, is contextualizing that cost better, right? If we can only get it down so far, how can I put that cost in context so that it doesn't just seem like this exorbitant line item, but it makes sense, or any small amount of cost change that we're able to achieve. How can I put that in context from a percentage basis, perhaps, as compared to cost savings that other markets are doing, so that even though I'm still, again, I'm making up numbers here, even though I'm still operating a program that costs $10, if I'm able to reduce it by $1, but every other market is only able to reduce their $1 program by a cent, that I highlight that difference.
Makes sense. And it's a great example of how your role is really critical in being able to make that case through data and through the decisions that you made day to day.
Yeah.
I see your question, Tiffany. I have one more question before I'm going to ask yours, but I'm curious if you have if you have thoughts around this, in particular, now that you've been in this role for some time. For the folks that are on this call that are listening, that may be interested in a role like this, an operations role at a bigger technology company, what advice would you give as far as the type of skills that they should be working on developing? Not only that would make them effective in that role, but actually that would make them marketable for that role when somebody's looking at their resume and considering hiring them.
Totally. Project management, people management, and data analytics. Those would probably be the three, undoubtedly. The people management doesn't necessarily need to be that you have people who are working directly for you, although that's helpful. What I really mean by that is that in operations, especially at a company, a big IPO'd company like Lyft, everything you do is going to touch other teams. You won't be able to make a decision without getting input from another team. And so you really need to learn how to manage people laterally, manage people below you, and also manage up. So any instance where you can show that. So I guess another way you could cross-functional work. Those three, I think, would be the biggest. And on the data analytics side, again, I wasn't proficient at it, but what I mean by that is, like, if you have a set of information, you can categorize it appropriately based on a question you're trying to ask. You can ask the right types of questions, and you can find the right resources to help you get the real nitty-gritty answers. But having an understanding of how to manipulate data, how to look at data, is really important.
And you also mentioned project management. Is that something that you really kind of self-learn or learn on the job, or do you have any recommendations for like resources or things that you would do to learn that skill?
One thing I would add to that is, like, how many operations people that you worked with had PMP certification, for example? Do you think that's necessary?
So I don't think it's necessary, although there were a number of people at Lyft while I was there who were pursuing that. Lyft is really good about encouraging additional certifications or extra learning outside of the job. One place where you can get some quick resources on project management, I would start on Udemy. I love Udemy for all sorts of things, not just project management, but there are some good courses there. And then, yeah, if you wanted to take the extra step, I think you could go for a PMP certification, and that definitely would make you stand out. For me, I personally just learned it on the job. Like I mentioned, I Googled project management, again, like as simple as that, and started writing notes for myself and then slowly kind of implementing those things. or talking to people who've done it in their jobs in the past.
Yeah, and I love that, doing through experience, because then, once you've actually applied it, if somebody in an interview situation asks you about your experience with project management, you can actually speak to real things that you've done to implement it in other companies, and so it's
100%.
really impactful.
And the great thing to hear is that you don't necessarily need that certification, so I wouldn't have that prevent you from going after the opportunity. Focus more on developing that skill, or thinking back to your experience and figuring out how you can position your past experience to fit the narrative of you being a operational person, a project management, a person that can handle a lot of projects, a lot of clients.
Yeah, I also want to say that project management doesn't have to mean that you own like a massive project like I've been talking about, the wheelchair accessibility program. You can create opportunities, and I said this quite frequently to someone who was working for me at Lyft, that you can create project management opportunities out of even the smallest task that gets assigned to you if you approach it with the project management mentality. So even if it's a small task, start with, what's the goal of this task that I'm being asked to do? What is the outcome that I need? If there are metrics based on the task you're doing, what are the metrics? And then what are the steps? Like, as simple as that to start. And if you get yourself in the habit of doing that, you can start to create these opportunities for yourself.
Love that. Thank you for that. So Tiffany said, hi, Nicole, thank you for speaking with us. My question for you is, where do you see yourself in the future? Do you see yourself continuing to work in the tech industry after HBS, or do you want to venture into another industry?
Great question, Tiffany. I thought I had a really great idea of what I wanted to do. And then I think, as most people, COVID has just caused everyone to take a step back and think about quality of life, career, etc. So I don't have as a buttoned up answer to this, Tiffany, right now as I would want, although I'm going to spend the next 4 weeks before school trying to drill down a little bit. But I'll tell you a few things that I feel really sure about. One, I absolutely loved the work I was doing with the wheelchair accessibility program, because I felt like I was really truly making an impact in people's lives. So social impact is definitely something that I want to incorporate in my work in the future, whether that's literally working for a social impact team at a company like Lyft, who does great work, or whether that's working more on the investment side and doing impact investing. The second thing is that I am really passionate about services. So I don't see myself working at a company that's necessarily offering a product, although don't quote me, but I really enjoy creating incredible experiences for consumers. So definitely something that's in the services space. And then the last piece is, I'm really fascinated by small and emerging markets. I think you hear a lot, there's a lot of talk about companies unicorn and they grow really fast, but most of the business that's done in the US is happening on the small and medium scale. And from my experience at Lyft, as well as my former companies, I enjoy working at companies of that size. So I do want to focus on the sort of like the small and emerging markets and small, medium-sized businesses. So hopefully combining those three things, social impact, small and emerging markets. I'm forgetting the third thing that I just said there. As I said, still formulating everything. Yeah, I wish I had a better answer, but I think nobody really ever has this completely figured out. And if I'm going to turn this into an advice moment, what I would say, and what I'm really grateful for with my career thus far, is I haven't been afraid, and another mentor of mine told me this, I haven't been afraid to take an opportunity that feels a bit out of the box. As long as I can create a little bit of a thread in terms of the type of company, or rather the functionality of what I'm doing, not the type of company, the functionality of what I'm doing, then it's okay to do something totally, completely different. And the opportunities that I've taken have really been driven by my feeling inspired by the people I was going to be working with and for. So if you don't know exactly what your next step is, that's okay. Start as simple as, what are you good at? And so look at that particular function, and then what types of people do you want to work with, and start there. And if it's something that's off the beaten path for you, that could actually be exciting and be helpful for you in the future.
That's a great thing to close on, Nicole. And it does sound simple, but it's critical. Like, what are you, like, leaning into what you're good at and finding people that you love spending time with, that you actually respect and want to learn from every day should be the basis of the career decisions that you make, more than I think anything else. And I love to hear that that's how you approach it as well.
Yeah, and not being too hard on yourself. It's okay to change your mind. You might think you have things figured out now, and you might feel a year or two from now that that no longer is the case, and that's okay too. Interests change. You know, as you accumulate knowledge, you might want to dig into another area. I love what you said about finding an opportunity that allows you to at least connect the dots somehow, having some kind of thread, because that thread is nice to have when you're trying to create a story about your background and yourself, but it doesn't mean it has to be perfect. It doesn't perfectly has to build up on itself. Our careers are becoming more and more dynamic now, and I think people can be a little bit easier on themselves. I think that's great advice.
Totally.
Well, thank you so much, Nicole, for spending the
Yeah.
hour with us. Thank you for everybody that joined us today. Vadim just dropped the link for the survey. We really appreciate it if you take the minute to fill it out. We can send you the recording from this session, and we're also going to send you information in about 10 minutes here about the program that we mentioned in the info sessions. But again, thanks so much, Nicole. We really appreciated this conversation. We appreciate your transparency and guiding us through your story. And good luck with everything else. Good luck with HBS and the next step of your journey.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate you joining.
All right. Thank you
Thanks,
all.
Nicole.
We'll see you all next week. Thank you, Nicole.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Good one, everyone.
Great. Thank you all. We see the thank yous coming in. Thank you. Thank you, Lindsay.
All right, and
Great.
Pumpkin wants to go outside, so we're gonna let her out.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.